I doubt many of my regular viewers will be surprised by my confession that Part 1 was originally supposed to be its own standalone essay on how romanticism killed romance, and the only reason it's getting a Part 2 is because I spent about 70% of that script ranting about the recipes for comedy instead. However, despite this, I'd fully intended to honor that ad hoc label. That was until I'd happened upon a video titled "Why We'll Never Get Another Lord of the Rings," wherein it was described the real origins of the fantasy genre in modern literature. Up until watching it, I, like most people, had been under the preeminent preconception that Tolkien had been called the father of fantasy for exactly that reason. But, as was soon revealed to me, while Tolkien and his most famous work was the vehicle through which the fantasy genre, as we've come to know it, was founded, and it was in its image that the mold was initially cast, the motivation behind its founding was not, as I'd originally presumed, entirely the function of anarcho-cultural forces, but of cold, cynical corporate industrialism. I'll be completely honest, I'm not sure what disgusts me more. The fact that this somehow came as news to me given my awareness of the shallow, egotistical dysentery that was the post-war economic and political landscape and zeitgeist, or that I'm in no way actually surprised by it. In short, what we call fantasy should really be called the left hand of the Del Rey model of fiction, the right hand being science fiction, modeled after Gene Roddenberry's original Star Trek series, since it was the most profitable example of its kind during the same time period. So, in actual fact, Lester Del Rey is really the father of modern fantasy, since it was he who first set down the established formula which would become the genre's de facto definition going forward. According to Lester, the criteria for a fantasy story were as follows: original novels set in invented worlds in which magic works. Each would have a male central character who triumphed over the forces of evil, usually associated with technical knowledge of some variety, by innate virtue and with the help of a tutor or tutelary spirit. As soon as I read that, I knew what this video's subject had to be. As the poster who we have to thank for this image on screen said, genre is nothing but a marketing container for commodified art. While I could spend the next 13 billion years simply listing and complaining about all the innumerable instances in which corporatocracy and the pea-brained Neanderthals who operate it has systematically soiled all aspects of human existence, remembering a comment I got on a recent upload about how I was one of the only content creators that person had come across who'd dare to offer a potential solution to a problem rather than just ranting and raving about it ad nauseum, I figured it would be far more productive for me to go straight for what I believe to be the heart of the matter, and attempt to introduce, if not a true counteractive agent, then at least a salving ointment to the bloated, festering wound on our nation's pride and soul. The original article from which the above criteria were lifted prefaced that with the statement by describing Lester Del Rey's disdain for academics, professional critics, and snobby novelists. And while there's absolutely room for criticism of anyone who purports to be of higher-than-average mind, especially when they're exposed to be some pretentious, mediocre clowns wearing their fancy diplomas or pedigrees as intellectual costumes, in my mind this just exemplifies the overall barbaric sentiment among the political and economic elites, particularly the industrial types, that being motivated to do anything for any reason other than monetary profit is inherently idiotic and uncivilized. Some of you may have heard the myth that soda cans were specifically engineered to be the ideal size for both the hand and the fridge. But I call this a myth because, in actual fact, soda cans were designed to give you just enough to get you to buy more. And that too is emblematic of two separate but related phenomena that I suppose could be considered half of the four fundamental forces of economics. Because I'm me, I've chosen to call these the Coke can fallacy and the Dragon Slayer's paradox. You're obviously already acquainted with the former, but to put it in more specific terms, it describes a functional disconnect between the problem being addressed and the problem actually being solved. For another example, when people ask questions like, why aren't people having babies? What they're really wanting to know is, how can we get people to make more workers and consumers for our economy without having to actually do anything for them, like increasing wages and security or lowering living costs? This is what I described before with the soda cans. The reason these items are built how they are isn't to make them more convenient for customers, it's to increase profits for corporations. Any benefits customers experience as a result are strictly a side effect. It's the same reason why you see corporate executives and investors making moves that overtly hurt their companies in the long term. As I've said before, nobody actually cares about the world, society, the culture, the nation, or even their own friends and family. Each and all of these things, in the minds of most people, exist to service their own needs and wants, not the other way around. Correspondingly, until or unless the beast starts circling his homestead, the Dragon Slayer doesn't really care about slaying the dragon. His actual problem is that he needs food and shelter to live, which he acquires by trading away bits of precious metal to people who have and/or produce them. It just so happens that he also has skills in the ways of hunting dragons, and so he goes about solving his own problem of paying his living expenses by solving other people's problems of a flying, fire-breathing lizard burning their houses and eating their livestock, trading his skills for coin, which he then trades for life's necessities, and if business is particularly good, a couple little pleasures on the side. The problem the astute among you will have spotted with this arrangement is that better fortunes for the Dragon Slayer means an abundance of bigger, deadlier problems for everyone else. If you've ever heard the phrase perverse incentive structure, this is what that means. It's when the system is structured to promote the opposite behavior of what was originally intended. The actual official term for this is the Cobra Effect, named after an incident back in colonial India when then British officials offered bounties on cobra tails to try and reduce the cobra population. So the Indians started breeding cobras to get more money. When the British caught on, they ended the program and the breeders just dumped the now valueless snakes into the wild, thus making the problem considerably worse than it originally was to start with. Now, I mentioned a quaternity of forces a minute ago, did I not? You may be wondering, what are the other two? Glad you asked, hypothetical voice I made up in my head. The third is what I've elected to name the branding bubble, which is what caused the Del Rey phenomenon I led us into this rabbit hole with. Think of it like this. Imagine I was to have a private sit-down conversation with a prominent religious personality, and through facts and logic completely sold them on the idea that their magical beliefs are as fake as Santa Claus and modern monetary theory. Do you think they would ever willingly say so out loud? Of course not. Why? For the same reason as why no politician will ever admit to having a bad policy, or no corporate executive will acknowledge their bad decisions. In essence, it will tank their future elections, career prospects, or brand image. Thus, the incentive of all those in charge is to never address problems, since the first step in solving a problem is admitting that you have one, unless they can market themselves as the solution and put all the blame on some external other or nebulous boogeyman that they lose nothing by attacking, such as the devil or the left or the right or the bourgeoisie or men or feminism or the boomers or Gen Z, etc., etc. Which leads us nicely into point 4, the token demand problem, which describes the fact that demand, not supply, is what dictates a market's landscape and output. If nobody wants or can afford to buy what you're selling, it's worth nothing. Therefore, the real selection criteria of any market space is not the objective worth or quality of a product, because there is no such thing, but how effectively it can be marketed. And that's why certain products and business models tend to make more headway than others, not because they're objectively better, but because they're that much easier to sell. For instance, as of 2024, mobile gaming accounts for about 49% of the total global gaming market. The reasons for this aren't hard to see or understand. Pretty much everyone already has a smartphone, most people like games, and a sizable chunk of these are free to play. So overall, it's much easier to convince people to take that plunge than it would be to get them to first purchase a $500 console, then also go out and buy an $80 game which can only be played on that console, which in most cases needs to be plugged into the wall and to a TV, and often requires internet service in order to work at all, so they could only use it when they're at home. This is why theaters are dying off. People just aren't as willing to shovel out $20 or $30 to go sit in a crowded room and watch a movie that may or may not even be good when they know that same film can be viewed from the comfort of their own couch in a few months when it comes out on streaming. It's also why all the major religions that exist today, or at least all of their most mainstream sects, all have the singular common element of making grandiloquent promises while requiring almost nothing in return except that you pay your requisite taxes, attend their services on a regular basis, and turn the logical parts of your brain off so they can sell you on eternal paradise without needing to explain it in terms of real math and physics. But anyway, I said I was coming to this table with solutions, and so far all I've brought is a truckload of more problems. Well, while I'd like to say I have the perfect answers to the issues of human greed and stupidity, I cannot say that without being as transparent a liar as the grifters I've just spent the last 5 or 10 minutes deriding. However, at least as far as literature and art are concerned, I do at least come bearing some answers. Whether or not they're of any practical use, I'll leave up for you to judge. In case the thumbnail didn't give it away, I'm talking about the Omniverse again. And no, it's not just to shill my books this time, although I do have several of relevant note if you're interested, links down below, but to show you how we could use the formulas of modern corporate fiction for the advantage of true creativity, which will come in extremely handy for the upcoming future, if not the very present, wherein the sizable majority of content will be made autonomously via algorithmic generation, without any genuine human interaction or presence. We've all heard the endless droning about how there's nothing new under the sun when it comes to our media landscape, how everything's so boring and sterile, that it's all paint-by-numbers corporate slop made by committee for the sole purpose of maximizing profits for the studios. This is all true and perfectly valid criticism, but it misses the critical point that trends are trendy for a reason. Tropes don't exist at random. Things that are popular because they make somebody money. The same YouTuber who enlightened me thuswise had another video wherein she fired shots at the omnipresent spread of smut, basically literary corn minus the C. And while I can respect where she was coming from, not to shame people for their interests, but to address this cynical distillation of art into fiscal quarters and profit margins, at no point did she think to notice the simple and obvious fact that sex sells as well in print as it does in sports and video games. So, given that trying to fight against natural selection is like trying to win a race against your own feet, how are we to address this problem? How can we, as aspirant creatives, hope to compete against the mainstream giants with their infinite advertising dollars, bottomless IP mines, and now their arsenals of artificial brain farms? Well, the short and unappealing answer is we can't. However, the slightly longer and more hopeful answer is we don't need to. You see, while the corporate AI algorithms can and will churn out infinite vats of intellectual gruel, they are not infinitely profound, meaning they still work within the bounds of the market. They will only produce that which people demand, meaning if nobody thinks to input a prompt that strays outside the mold of what has already been established, the machine cannot and will not come to this destination by its own means. In short, the machines can create, but they cannot innovate. At least, not yet. That is where the Omniverse comes in. You see, when I was first constructing my Flint Pirate Academy series, the biggest and most persistent problem I had was in how to go about marketing the damn thing, since I drew inference and inspiration from pretty much every sphere of metaphysical terrain I knew of. And so summarizing it in terms that would both A, resonate with people enough to make them want to give money to investigate it, and B, convince them of a reasonable probability of there being gold beneath this multi-spectral rainbow mash was pushing my rhetorical limits trying to spell out. But now I've thought, you know what? Rather than trying to fight the current, why not just lean into it? Embrace the chaos of, the apparently lost art of combining 3 or 4 related items. I appreciate this isn't quite as solution-heavy as I would have liked. Remember, 99.99% of all creative endeavors fail, which is why no marketable business wants to actually be creative. They want predictable outcomes. Business is naturally adverse to risks, as those tend to foreshadow loss. And in the modern world where line must always go up or else world go kaboom, it's not hard to compute why everyone's a trendsetter or a marketing guru right up until tax season or the next quarterly earnings report rolls around. Anyway, I think I'll leave that right there. Like I said, I'd come into this thinking I could shed some positive light onto the horizon, but ultimately concluded there's nothing really that I can say that either hasn't already been said or that would actually change the brutal industrialist into a creative visionary. I guess the short and long of this video's premise is, the first and foremost question every man must ask of himself is, does he love most his sanity, his security, his station, or his soul? But before we start getting too prosaic, I'm just going to quickly plug all my books, merch, and alternate channels and bid you all until next time, as always, stay safe, stay sane, and always remember, you can never think too much, you can only think badly. Peace be upon you.